dive in. Today we're tackling something that's practically everywhere: sugar. And judging by the stack of research papers, articles, even meeting minutes you've sent, you're on a mission to uncover all its secrets, which is perfect because so are we.
What's fascinating is how far sugar's reach extends. We're talking brain chemistry, industry maneuvers, global
You
policies.
weren't kidding. I mean, check out this map of sugary drink taxes around the world.
It really highlights a global shift, wouldn't you say? A recognition that we need to be paying attention to sugar. But before we go global, let's zoom in. You highlighted some intriguing research about how different types of sugar, specifically glucose and fructose, affect the brain in totally different ways.
Okay, so we're not just talking about a quick sugar rush here. This is about what's actually happening in our heads. Break it down for us. What's the science behind these sugar differences?
Well, think of glucose as the brain's VIP guest. It's the primary energy source, easily crosses the blood brain barrier, no problem.
Okay, so glucose is powering the brain. What about fructose?
Fructose, it's a little more complicated. It can cross the blood brain barrier, but not as easily. And even more importantly, our brains can't use it directly for energy the way we can with glucose.
So it's getting in, but it's not exactly fueling the brain party. What happens once these sugars are past the gates?
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Research has shown that when we consume glucose, it sets off a specific chain reaction in the brain.
Like what? Spill the neurological tea.
Well, activity actually decreases in the hypothalamus, which is basically the brain's appetite control center. And at the same time, there's this spike in activity in the reward pathways.
So it's like the brain is saying, we're good here. Time to relax, enjoy. What about fructose? Does it crash the party?
Not a crasher, but it definitely doesn't get the same welcome. See, even though it sneaks into the brain, fructose doesn't have that same impact on the hypothalamus or the reward centers. And this difference in the brain's response, it could explain why people tend to overconsume things that are high in fructose.
Makes sense. You don't get that same I'm full and satisfied signal from the brain.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it can make a big difference.
So the takeaway is that not all sugars are processed the same way in the brain. We really need to watch out for fructose, specifically, because it can lead us to eat more than we intend to.
Exactly. And this brings us to the crux of why so many governments and health organizations are concerned. They're recognizing the potential risks of excessive sugar, especially fructose. That's where these sugar taxes on your map come into play, as well as a bunch of other strategies.
So these sugar taxes, we're not just talking about adding a few cents to a can of soda, right? This
Hmm.
is about using taxes to shift behavior on a massive scale.
Oh, absolutely. And the really interesting thing is how each country takes a different approach. For example, you sent over some fascinating material on what's happening in Malaysia.
Right. It seems like they're really tackling this head on with a tax on sugary drinks, trying to combat rising obesity rates. I'm curious, though, how are the big beverage companies reacting to this?
Well, there are always some growing pains with this kind of policy change, but you included these meeting minutes from Fraser and Neva. They're a major player in the Malaysian beverage market, FNN for short. And their CEO statement is fascinating.
Oh, CEO statements. You know there's going to be some carefully chosen words in there. What's the message?
They're definitely aware of the tax and they know they need to adapt. They even committed to reformulating a huge chunk of their product line, something like 70%, to cut down the sugar content.
Wow, 70%. That's a bold move. Seems like they're taking this tax seriously. What does that mean for the consumer, though? Will we see price hikes because of these changes?
That's the million-dollar question. And it seems like FNN's CEO is trying to walk a fine line here. They acknowledge the cost of reformulating these drinks, but their stance seems to be that increasing prices is a last resort.
A delicate dance, for sure. Keep the consumers happy, keep the profits up, and follow the new rules. It's high stakes for these companies. So how is it all playing out? Any early indicators of how this sugar tax is impacting Malaysia?
It's still early days, and long-term data is limited. However, we can see some trends emerging. For example, right after the tax was announced, big beverage companies like Nestle, Dutch Lady, and of course F&N saw their stocks dip.
Ah, yes. The market hates uncertainty. Makes sense that this kind of policy would cause a stir, but did those stock dips last?
From what we can see, the initial drop seems to have been temporary. The Malaysian Association of Tea and Coffee Merchants MATA even weighed in, predicting the impact on the market would be short-lived.
So a bit of a roller coaster for the beverage giants, but it seems they're adapting. It's fascinating to see these huge economic forces responding to public health initiatives. But what about the smaller businesses? Your local shops. How have they reacted?
You included this really insightful quote from the chairman of the Kuching Coffee Shop and Restaurant Owners Association. And it really sums up the uncertainty many of these businesses are facing. He said it was simply too early to tell what the impact would be, both for businesses and for customers.
A very cautious response. I can imagine there's a lot of wait and see happening on the ground.
Absolutely. And while he couldn't predict long-term effects, he did imply that price increases might be unavoidable if they have to cover these higher costs from a sugar tax.
It's a tough situation to navigate. Government regulations, fluctuating ingredient costs, trying to keep your customers happy. It really speaks to the complexity of this issue, doesn't it? But Malaysia is just one piece of the puzzle. What about the bigger picture? Are other countries adopting sugar taxes as well?
They are. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's really incredible to see the diversity in how different countries are tackling this, each reflecting their own priorities, social contexts, and economic realities.
So it's not as simple as saying this is the best way to do it.
Yeah.
What are some of the different sugar tax strategies we're seeing around the world?
Well, some countries, like Nigeria, have gone with a straightforward per liter tax on sugary drinks. Others, like South Africa, base their tax on the amount of sugar per gram in a product. So it's a more direct link between how much sugar is in something and how much it's taxed.
Different approaches for different contexts. I'm really curious to see which strategies are most effective over time. Did any particularly innovative approaches stand out in your research?
Oh, Ecuador and Peru definitely caught my eye. They've implemented these really interesting tiered tax systems where the tax rate actually changes based on how much sugar is in a beverage. So it's
Ooh,
like a sliding scale of sweetness.
I like that. It
Mm.
seems more flexible, but still encourages those healthier options. Are taxes the only tool in the toolbox, though? What other strategies are governments and organizations using to address sugar consumption?
You're right. It's not all about taxes. There's a growing understanding that this issue is too complex and we need a more multifaceted approach to really tackle it.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. Besides taxes, what other strategies are being deployed in this global fight against sugar?
One really fascinating concept that's gaining traction is the use of command and control regulations, much like we've seen with environmental issues.
Command and control when it comes to sugar. That sounds intense. How would that actually work?
It's about setting very specific limits on the amount of sugar allowed in certain food and drinks. Think of it like this. Instead of taxing the final product, you're regulating the ingredients that go into making it.
So, less, here's a tax on that sugary drink, and more. You can't put more than this much sugar in there in the first place.
Exactly. It's a way to more directly influence just how much sugar ends up in the food we buy. Of course, this approach often goes hand in hand with other measures like public education or better food labeling.
Makes sense. So, it's not just about controlling what people buy, it's about giving them the information to make healthier choices for themselves. Were there any other innovative approaches in your research that don't rely on that level of control?
This idea of a Nutri-Grade system is really interesting, and it's getting a lot of attention as a way to make sugar taxes more effective, but also more transparent.
Nutrigrade, that's a new one. What's the idea behind it?
Imagine a system where all foods and drinks have a grade on the label that reflects how nutritious they are overall, and a major part of that grade is how much sugar they contain. So, more sugar equals a lower grade.
So it's like a school report card, but for your groceries. That's an image that's sure to resonate.
Exactly. Empowering people to make informed choices at a glance. And then you can link that system to sugar taxes. Lower graded sugary items get hit with higher taxes.
Ah, I see. A financial incentive for both consumers and producers to make healthier decisions. It's a two-pronged approach. But you mentioned a multifaceted strategy. What else is being done besides taxes, regulations, and these labeling systems.
Well, we can't forget the importance of education and awareness campaigns. It's not enough to control access to sugary foods or change their price. We also have to empower individuals with knowledge. They need the tools to make informed choices about their sugar intake.
Knowledge is power, right? Because if you understand what excessive sugar can do in the long run, you're more likely to make sustainable changes.
Exactly. And a big part of that is media literacy, especially for younger generations who are constantly bombarded with advertising for sugary treats. Teaching them to really think critically about those messages and make healthier choices, that's huge.
Right. It's about learning to see those tempting ads for what they're marketing, not necessarily a guide to a balanced diet. It seems like the global response to sugar is shifting from just taxation to a much wider, more nuanced approach.
Exactly. We're realizing there's no quick fix, no silver bullet. We need a multi-pronged strategy that combines policy changes, industry adaptation, and ultimately individual empowerment. We've covered so much ground already, from the global sugar scene down to those tiny molecules interacting with our brains. But there's one more layer we need to discuss, the psychological aspect of sugar. You've included some very compelling research on this.
You're right. We've been so focused on the global picture, we haven't even touched on how sugar affects us on an individual emotional level. And that's a whole other fascinating dimension.
It is, and this is where it gets really interesting. Sugar's impact goes way beyond our taste buds. It has a profound impact on our brains and potentially our emotional well-being.
We've explored a lot in our deep dive into sugar, from the subtle ways it influences our brain chemistry to how countries around the world are trying to manage it with taxes, regulations, you name it.
It's multifaceted, to say the
It
least.
really is. And speaking of multifaceted, you included some research on a less discussed aspect of sugar, its potential impact on our mental well-being. I found this really fascinating, especially those studies about sugar and mood disorders like anxiety and depression.
It's an area that deserves more attention. When you think about how connected our food choices are to how we feel, both physically and mentally, it makes sense that sugar might play a role in our emotional well-being.
It's not exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you reach for a cookie, right?
Yeah.
But we've all been there. You have a bad day and suddenly you need a pint of ice cream.
Right, exactly. Comfort food is a real phenomenon. And while those occasional indulgences are totally normal, I think this research challenges us to consider that chronic excessive sugar consumption could have a real impact on our mental health in the long term.
So we're not just talking about a quick mood boost followed by a crash. It's bigger than that.
It might be. One theory that researchers are exploring is that sugar, especially fructose, could actually be disrupting the balance of certain brain chemicals, neurochemicals that are essential for regulating mood.
Neurochemicals, now we're getting into the nitty gritty. What's actually happening at that chemical level when we consume too much sugar?
Well, some studies suggest that excess sugar intake can interfere with the production and function of serotonin, which is a key neurotransmitter that helps regulate mood, sleep, even appetite.
Serotonin, the feel good chemical, right?
Yeah.
So if sugar is messing with our brain's ability to produce or use serotonin effectively, it makes sense that our mood could be affected.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. There's also research looking into how sugar might trigger inflammation in the brain, which has been linked to mood disorders like depression.
Inflammation in the brain, that's not something you hear every day. We tend to associate inflammation with injuries or illnesses, not necessarily something happening in our brains.
It's true, but it's a real phenomenon, and it can have a serious impact on our mental health. When the brain is inflamed, it disrupts the way neurons communicate with each other, which not only affects mood, but can also impact things like cognitive function and even behavior.
Wow, so it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
We overload on sugar, it disrupts our brain chemistry, leads to inflammation, and then potentially triggers this whole cascade of issues, including mood disorders.
It's complex, that's for sure. And while we always need more research, there have been quite a few studies showing a correlation between high sugar intake and an increased risk of experiencing those symptoms of depression.
Definitely something to be mindful of. But it's important to remember correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because we see a link doesn't mean sugar is the sole cause of these mood disorders.
Right. It's never that simple. Our mental health is influenced by so many factors: our genes, our environment, our lifestyle choices, and yes, even what we choose to eat plays a role.
And we all respond to sugar differently, right? What might cause a noticeable mood swing in one person might have no effect on someone else.
Exactly. This isn't about demonizing sugar altogether. It's about arming ourselves with knowledge so we can make informed choices about our diets and our health. And of course, anyone with concerns about their sugar intake or how it might be affecting their mental health should always consult with a healthcare professional.
Very important to remember. It's about finding what works best for you and making choices that support your overall well-being, both physically and mentally. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of sugar. We've covered so much, from those intricate molecular interactions in our brains to the global efforts to manage sugar consumption, and now these potential links to our emotional and mental well-being.
It really highlights how interconnected it all is, our world, our bodies, our minds. It's fascinating.
It really is. So, as we wrap up this exploration of sugar, here's a final thought for you, our listener. If further research continues to strengthen this connection between sugar and mental health, could reducing our sugar intake emerge as a potential strategy for improving our mood and overall mental well-being? Something to chew on as you navigate our sugary world. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.